Good morning, everyone. Um, we'll just wait a few minutes here until people have a chance to log in. For anyone who's here right now, just want to make sure that audio is working. So if you can hear my voice, just type yes in the chat room. All right, so it seems to be working. So just wait a few more minutes or a few more moments until a few more people log in here. While you're doing that, or while we're waiting, just take a look at this first slide, just some before we get started type of information that you should just be aware of. I'll also just draw your attention on the top right-hand corner. There's the polls. So I see some of you have already answered that. Just make sure that you answer the question in terms of your affiliation with the CAF. And any identifiers, if you're answering that question, will be removed at the end of the webinar, so it'll be completely anonymous. I'll add two more questions as we go along, and those are more before we end the webinar, just for you to answer just a couple of feedback questions. There's also two handouts available. The participant workbook, although, again, this is an information session, so we're not following the participant workbook per se, but it's there for your information if you want it. And it's used with the butt-out program locally at your wing or base. And so that's why I also provided the local HP contact information, so that if you want to have more of a hands-on approach with butt-out, you can contact your local health promotion person at your specific wing or base. So there's those two handouts, the poll question, and like I said, I'll add the other two as we move along here, but please make sure that you answer the other two poll questions before we are finished today. So my name is Derek Enslow. I'm the Health Promotion Manager at 15 Wing Moose Jaw here in Saskatchewan. And this program, we haven't run it a lot in Moose Jaw, but it is available to all CAF members. And this is the 7th of 8 webinars over the last 7 weeks for this program that I've delivered. So today is going to be more of just sort of a wrap up in terms of, well, as the title suggests on the first slide, remaining a non-smoker. So I'm just going to review some of the things that were talked about in the previous weeks. That will just be very brief. The focus today will be on vaping, the pros and cons of vaping. So a little bit more content on that. Feel free to ask questions as we go along. And yeah, thank you. Good morning to you as well, Lisa. So again, before we get started, if you haven't already read this, again, sort of the usual blurb before all of our webinars is that the presentation's intellectual property of D&D. So any retransmission, reproduction is strictly prohibited. Although the content here, although we are going to be talking about vaping and the risks for children, you might want to just take some parental discretion if there's anything sensitive that you think that we're talking about. So parental discretion is advised. You're welcome to share stories at any time throughout the webinar, but anything that you do share, either in camera or chat, and that's the other thing. If you want to, I can activate your camera if you want to talk, or your microphone, or you can just ask a question or make a comment in the chat room. But all of that won't be discussed. Anything you mention here will not be discussed outside of the webinar. And keeping in mind as well, this webinar is being recorded and will be available for later viewing. All the webinars are going to be available on the CFMWS CAF Connection YouTube channel. Some of the previous ones are already there if you're interested. And so we definitely encourage your participation. And unless you have any questions before I get started, I'll just move along to the next slide. So like I said, we're going to talk about remaining smoke-free to start. probably for about the first 10 minutes or so, and then we're going to talk about vaping. So sort of an overview of this first part is just looking at the blueprint that I've talked about the last few weeks, a quick review of physical activity and relaxation plans, a little bit talking about relapse, and then sort of just some indications of when you have made it, in terms of being smoke-free. So the blueprint here, again, I've talked about sections of this blueprint over the last few weeks. And usually when people get to this stage in the Bud Out program, we review this to see what's working, what isn't, and maybe making some updates, reviewing it. Maybe something didn't work for you, and you want to make a change. So we review things like, what are your reasons for quitting smoking? Maybe when you started, you had certain reasons for quitting smoking, but that's changed. Then the second part there is your reasons to smoke. So that could be something like, to relieve stress, or, just for boredom. Maybe take that up the activity for out of boredom. And then there's certain situations where that anxiety, that stress, that boredom may present itself. So you want to make sure then that you recognize what those situations are. And then we talked about making alternatives, or choosing alternatives. And that could be something like, if you're bored and you smoke, well, then maybe you take up another hobby. Instead of smoking, maybe you take up woodworking, or just something to occupy your hands. It could be anything. But again, we go back at the end of the program and we sort of review, are these things working? Maybe they're not. Maybe sort of taking care of your boredom with woodworking isn't working. So now you need to try something else. So we review all of that. And then we start to review your relaxation plan, your physical activity plan, which I'll get specifically into those in a few seconds. But maybe you see the other two boxes there, my helpers and my rewards. So maybe the people who are helping you, maybe they weren't the best people to choose to help. It could have been a family member, a friend, a non-smoker. So maybe you need to choose another person that can help you through the process of quitting smoking a bit better. And then maybe some of the rewards that you chose, whether it's going shopping or going on a trip or whatever it might be, that isn't working for you either. So again, this is all about reviewing at this stage in the Bud Out program. Specifically with your physical activity plan, we look at the 3 areas of physical activity that we discussed in a previous webinar: your endurance activities, flexibility, strength. And you then start to look at each one, and you answer these questions. Were the activities enjoyable or painful, easy, hard, helpful, harmful, useful, useless, important, or silly? And maybe you start to realize, well, I need to do something else. I need to do a different type of activity. Maybe you chose yoga, but yoga isn't for you. And so maybe, going to a Pilates class or something different, or just something altogether different. Going out for a walk in nature is something that's going to work for you a bit better. So we review that and then start to decide which physical activities are working for you. When you decide which ones are now working for sure, you then start to, if you haven't already, for each area, endurance, flexibility, and strength, you then start to work out a plan of when you're going to do these activities and for how long. And we talked last week about, the physical activity guidelines for people ages, no, I'm forgetting, I think it's like 18 to 64. You need to exercise at least 150 minutes per week. I'm sure a lot of people get more than that, but at least 150 minutes per week. And so dividing those up between the 3 areas of endurance, flexibility, and strength is what you would want to do. You then basically do the same thing with your relaxation plan. And, we talked about different types of activities you could do, everything from physical activity to taking time to laugh, as it shows at the top of the screen there. And again, looking and seeing, do you find these activities enjoyable, painful, easy, hard, helpful, harmful, useful, useless, important, or silly? And again, review that plan. Maybe there's something else you need to do. Any questions about the physical activity plans, anything else in the blueprint. Again, I just kind of going through this a little quickly because we have talked about it in previous weeks, but I just wanted to take a moment just to review that in case there's any new people here. And all of this is uh, in the workbook that's available in the handout section of this webinar. So, like I said, all of that we would do, and we'd fill out that first table that you saw there for the blueprint. We would fill that out over the 8 weeks of the program, if we were doing this, in person at our wings and bases. So there's lots of time over the 8 weeks to sort of review that. But definitely when we get to this stage in the butt out program, we want to make sure that people have a solid plan moving forward, so that, as this screen says, if you've had a relapse, you can then now go back to your blueprint and see again which areas aren't working, which need more improvement. And knowing that a relapse is common. So that's why it's important to have a solid blueprint and have it written out exactly how you're going to handle those cravings, those situations that are triggers for smoking, and really come back to that. And really, you're not going to know until you're in those situations what alternatives work for you or what other types of activities work for you, so that you don't have a relapse, or you don't, pick up a cigarette, or start to then, it becomes more of a regular pattern. Some people feel bad about it, and get critical. Anyone, who's maybe tried to quit before here, maybe has felt this, where you've maybe been smoke free for a few weeks or months, and then all of a sudden the situation arises and it entices you to smoke, and you start to feel bad about it, or maybe guilty. And when you have that, that's not a bad thing. That means you really care about quitting smoking. It's something that you want to do. So having those feelings are perfectly natural. Um, there will be lessons learned. Again, what works and what doesn't to help you quit. And so you want to sort of review what those lessons are. Maybe it's a situation that you commonly find yourself in. You need to find maybe a way to escape that situation, or other mechanisms, coping mechanisms you could use to better get through those trigger times or those stressful times. Review the blueprint, which I talked about, and so that is definitely something that you want to do always. And then the water wings. We talked in one of the weeks, one of the webinars, about water wings, and that being, the prescription medications or the nicotine replacement therapy, whether it's the gum, the patch, or any other form that's out there. So maybe you are on a medication to help you and it's just not working. Maybe the side effects aren't something that you want to have. Or maybe, if you aren't used to chewing gum and you're using the gum as a nicotine replacement therapy, maybe you want to try either a nasal spray or a patch or some other type of nicotine replacement therapy. But we did talk about where it's really a good idea to have either nicotine replacement or prescription medication just as a fallback, so that, not to do it on your own, but you sort of have that safety net of the nicotine replacement therapy or prescription medication to help you out. So relapses are common. People, try to quit many, many times and have a relapse, and that's perfectly okay. You've made it, though, when you don't have the urge to smoke. So when those alternatives that you chose, when those become natural and comfortable. And so when you're in those situations, you, instead of smoking, you decide to go for a walk. Or, if you're really stressed out, maybe meditation is something you use rather than smoking. Whatever it might be. Again, it's what works for you. At that point, when you don't have that urge, that's a good indication that you can now safely stop working at change. You've reached the point of now being a non-smoker, which the last point there, viewing yourself as a non-smoker. If you view yourself as a non-smoker, it does take a long time, but if you can no longer imagine yourself with a cigarette, then you have developed the mentality of a non-smoker. And the second point, if you prefer non-smoking, so when you get to the point where you actually prefer not to have a cigarette, that whatever alternative you've chosen and where not smoking is more satisfying, then you've achieved your goals. So I don't know of anyone that's listening here this morning, if you've had that experience, if you have quit in the past or you're currently quitting, If these are things that sort of ring true or not, you can just simply say yes or no in the chat room if you like. Or if you're still, you haven't gotten there, or this is your first time, or you're just here for information, that's perfectly fine as well. Yeah, so those are common things, I think, and so don't look at it as a failure if you've tried to quit before and then you've had a relapse and you're not seeing, the urges go away, or you prefer to smoke rather than the alternatives. That's perfectly fine. It usually takes multiple attempts to quit smoking. But as you go through the Bud Out program, um, you know, this program definitely is better in person, I think. But again, given our circumstances that we're in right now, offering it this way, we'll give you some good information if you are thinking of quitting smoking. And then when you're actually can have, and some bases and wings are reopening now, definitely contact your local health promotion people, and they can help you in a more hands-on way in your quit attempt. But so that's basically all I wanted to talk about in reviewing what has been discussed in the last few weeks. So if you have any questions before I move on to the discussion on vaping, feel free now, or if you think of something moving forward, just ask a question in the chat room. But if not, I'll move on and have our little discussion on vaping. So I will use interchangeably, or either calling it electronic cigarettes or vaping or vape. So if I use one or the other, it means the same thing. So in this discussion, so once I get through this portion of the webinar, you should be able to sort of describe the controversy around e-cigarettes or vaping, prevalence of use, the devices and its main components, understand how e-cigarettes or vaping does fit into our harm reduction model, and then of course we'll discuss a little bit the health effects of vaping. So the primary sections that I'll talk about will be the harm reduction approach, just really quickly, so you have an understanding, if you don't already, of what that is. A little bit about the policies around vaping within the CAF, the prevalence of use, what vaping or e-cigarette use is, the health effects, a little bit on the debate of e-cigarettes, and then we'll conclude. And feel free, again, if you have questions along the way, just enter those in the chat room. So as I said, for vaping or e-cigarettes, it sort of follows a harm reduction approach. And if you're not familiar with harm reduction approach, this is a basic description of what it is. It seeks to reduce health and social harms associated with addiction and substance use, but not requiring people to quit or abstain from using the product. So that's why vaping or e-cigarettes is seen as a harm reduction approach, because it is, and you'll see with some of the upcoming slides, it is less harmful than smoking a cigarette. And there is some evidence that it does help people to stop smoking. However, there is controversy with that, and that's why I'm talking about it today. There's some debate as to whether or not it is a good harm reduction approach, or whether or not it is it is less harmful than smoking cigarettes. So we will talk about that today. But again, these strategies that are used, it's usually used with an educational component, or it should be, so that people can enhance their skills and knowledge around the different ways or different things that can help you to quit smoking, in this case, possibly vaping, with the goal of making sure that people live healthier and safer lives. The policy around vaping within the CAF. So there's two, the DOAD 5020 and CanForgin 09314. Basically, you can't smoke or you can't vape in the workplace, just as you cannot smoke in the workplace unless it's outside in a designated smoking area. So that's what the DOAD states there. So it's treating vaping the same as smoking a cigarette. What the CanForgin is saying there is that, there is a harm. Because there is a harm associated with uh, vaping, they treat it the same as a tobacco product. There are some, I mean, some people can use an e-cigarette without nicotine or use some of the other liquids that you can put into them to help them quit smoking. But essentially, it's still treated as harmful and in the same category as a tobacco product. And so that's why the CanForge in there follows Health Canada's advisory on vaping. So I'm not here to talk about policies per se, but that's just to give you some idea of how the CAF views vaping. And again, it's the same as cigarettes. The prevalence of cigarette or e-cigarette use. Oh, my screen just froze there. Just bear with me 1 second. There we go. So this graph here just shows you the prevalence of e-cigarette use or vaping. So as you can see in the every use there's been a steady increase in vaping since 2013. Now this goes up to 2017, so 3 years ago. Some of the studies that I've seen previously even show a higher increase leading up to 2020. Past 30-day use has been somewhat on the increase. Not a significant drop between 2015 and 2017, kind of steady. And then daily use is low, but it's remained constant in the last few years. In terms of amongst young adult males, well, and females are listed there as well, but e-cigarette use is most common among young adult males. So you'll see there between the ages, sort of the highest group there is the 20 to 34. If you combine those two together, that's the group that uses it the most, both males and females, but more so for young males. Probably what's more concerning is the 15 to 19 age group, where there seems to be a very high prevalence of use in that age group. And even getting access to cigarettes, seem to be getting more access to the vaping or e-cigarettes compared to actual tobacco product. And if you look at by sex and smoking status, obviously smokers are going to use the vapes or e-cigarettes more compared to non-smokers in terms of both every use and past 30-day use. But again, it's the young adult males in particular that are of concern in terms of use, because even if you combine age 15 to 34, that's, we're quick math in my head here, we're looking at a very high percentage, around 70% or more. So it is common. It's very common in that age demographic. So what is vaping? So vaping, it's the act of inhaling and exhaling an aerosol produced by a vaping product, such as an electronic cigarette. So it's actually, and I have a little graph here to show you how it works. You're creating an aerosol. When you're inhaling the liquid, it turns into an aerosol, and then that white smoke that people blow out is the end product of that. It doesn't require burning like cigarette smoking. It contains like a liquid that gets heated into a vapor, which then, as it goes through your system, as I said, turns into an aerosol. And this vapor is often flavored, but it can contain nicotine. And there's some products out there that actually contain cannabis oil as well, but we're not going to get into that today. But that is another product that's available. There's cannabis oil can be used in an e-cigarette. When you might have heard some terms and when people describe vaping or e-cigarette products. I've looked up some of these. I'm not sure what a sub-ohm is, but that's one of the names that's used. Vape pens, those are probably more common. E-hookahs. The tank system, I'm not as familiar with. Definitely e-cigarettes. Another one, the electronic nicotine delivery system, so ENDS, which is kind of interesting in terms of some of the harms that have been seen related to vaping products. But they may also be known by their brand names, and there's a lot of vaping products that are out there. So this is a common vaping device. So it has a mouthpiece, and that has a little reservoir, and usually that's the piece that comes out, and you can go to the vape shops and buy that little reservoir, um, or they'll have a little container that you can pour into that reservoir, and that's where you put the vaping liquid. There's a heating element that heats up the liquid, and then there's a battery. Some of them have a replaceable battery, others you charge. You can just even charge it into the USB port of your laptop or computer. So they're very convenient, I guess you could say. But that's a general vaping device and what it looks like. Usually, again, if you don't have a vape device that has a replaceable reservoir, as it shows in this picture, you go to the vape shop and you get something like this bottle here that has the vaping liquid in it. It contains a carrier solvent, a flavor, and possibly nicotine, and like I said, possibly cannabis oil as well. So this is what you would buy to put into the vaping device. So basically how it works, so you put the liquid into the vaping device, it gets heated up by that element there. The element then turns it into an aerosol, um, which then enters into your body, into your lungs, and then that vapor that comes out at the end through your nose is the end product of the process of the vapor turning into an aerosol and then being expelled as that. It's not really smoke, it is a type of vapor. It's not like cigarette smoke, but that is generally what it's doing. So it's actually converting in your lungs when you're ingesting that combination of the liquid turning into a solvent and then into a vapor, or sorry, an aerosol and then into a vapor. So the health effects, there's been a lot of things in the news about vaping devices, some of which is true and some which isn't. We'll get into that in a second, but the health effects of vaping, it does depend on the battery power. A fully charged vaping device could possibly it's going to transport the aerosol the vapor into your body to convert it into an aerosol a lot faster when it's fully charged. So it does depend on the vaping of the battery power, the type of vaping device. So I've heard that the vaping pens they get the vapor into your lungs a lot faster than some of the other devices. The settings on the device, there's some devices that you can, in terms of how high you heat it up, in terms of inhalation. So you can change that in some of the devices. And of course, if you have a device that you heat it up more and you allow for faster inhalation, then of course that can possibly have more serious health effects than others at a lower power and less inhalation. The combination of the internal components, so how that's all put together and how it goes through the system of the vaping device, the liquid, the amount of nicotine. So that does depend. If you get a cheaper liquid, it can have other harmful chemicals in it. And then you can get some liquids that have higher amounts of nicotine. User behavior patterns. So again, how often, when you use it, obviously can have more of an impact on your health and the user's experience with vaping. Some people have really negative experiences because they'll inhale for too long, and that can have a really negative impact when you're inhaling more nicotine into your lungs. So it's not harmless. There is harm associated with the vaping device. It increases your exposure to harmful chemicals. And if you use it with nicotine, then obviously nicotine does lead to addiction. We don't know a lot. There's still not enough studies done about the long-term consequences of vaping. So there's still more research that needs to be done there. Again, and that's where the controversy around can it be used as a harm reduction strategy? Because we don't know the long-term health consequences per se, then the conversation around the harms is sort of put on hold until more research is done. It is rare, um, but some devices, basically, if you buy a really cheap device, there's probably an increased chance of it catching on fire, exploding, or it has defective batteries. So you probably have heard about people who have used the device and where it has sort of exploded on them. But it is very rare, and there's been some changes in the technology, and probably because of lawsuits, the companies have had to change some of the devices so that doesn't happen. So it's definitely not harmless. When you're vaping with nicotine, again, nicotine highly addictive and can lead to dependence. And there is some evidence that says there that it causes nicotine addiction among users who would not have started using nicotine otherwise, so through smoking. So some people will pick it up and they'll think that, oh, well, this is vaping, it's not as addictive, but if it does contain nicotine, because of the fact that it contains nicotine, it can be just as addictive as cigarette smoking. Kind of going through any questions from anybody? I'm kind of barreling through the slides here, but feel free if you have any questions just to ask me about anything you see on the screen there. We hear a lot about secondhand smoke and the harms of that results from people who are exposed to secondhand smoke. In terms of secondhand vapor, the health effects are unknown. But the risks, they're expected to be much lower compared to the smoke from a tobacco product. Just because the vapor that's coming out in the end, studies have shown that it doesn't contain as much nicotine if you're using nicotine compared to the combustion that occurs in a cigarette. There is some evidence, however, that e-cigarette use increases the level of nicotine and other chemicals on indoor surfaces. So that kind of makes sense in that, the vapor, it is a liquid that's being converted into a vapor, which could be, compared to cigarette smoke, have a little bit more moisture in it. So it may land on and stay on surfaces a lot longer than the smoke from cigarettes. So Tyler says, I don't like vaping because sometimes you have a really bad one and it's just nasty. Yeah, I've heard that. Smoking, yeah, smoking is as well, but some people have had really bad experiences with a vape pen or any other type of vaping device that's out there. I put this slide in here, but I mean, this should probably be obvious that, like smoking, vaping and pregnancy do not go together. While a vaping product does contain fewer harmful chemicals than cigarettes, it could still contain nicotine, and of course, nicotine is harmful to the baby. So talk with your healthcare provider if you are looking at options to quitting nicotine while you are pregnant. With vaping, 1 in 30 puffs makes you cough and die and taste horrible. I don't know if I mean, definitely smoking can decrease your life expectancy. But yeah, depending on the device, it can be have very negative health effects for sure. There is some concern because it is a liquid with nicotine poisoning when you're using a vaping device. So some people have tried to swallow the liquid, and even if you get it on your skin, even those small amounts, it can result in nicotine poisoning. It is meant to be turned from a liquid into an aerosol and then a vapor. So if you take the actual liquid and you ingest it, there is going to increase the chance of nicotine poisoning. And if you get it on your skin as well, although not as great a risk of nicotine poisoning, but it could still happen. Yeah, that is true, Tyler. The vape devices today, because some of them that have had negative, not just the effects of smoking nicotine through the vape device, but just some of them malfunctioning and catching on fire, things like that, as well as in terms of inhaling some of the older devices. in terms of the combustion process or the heating of the liquid in the older vape machines didn't turn it into an aerosol, so you're getting more liquid into your system in the older devices, whereas the devices today, it does get turned immediately into an aerosol because of the heating mechanisms that have been improved upon. So you are really just getting the vapor into your system and not so much liquid as in older devices. So although I don't know the history per se, I know that that change in the technology has resulted in fewer harmful effects compared to some of the older devices. You probably heard of popcorn lung. Um, However, I guess the thing to say here, because maybe it was, people who aren't experienced using the vaping device, probably inhaling too much. But the devices of today don't allow for greater inhalation, and so it's not very common anymore that you hear reports of popcorn lung occurring due to vaping. It's a lot of steps have been taken in the device in terms of its technology to prevent that from happening. So it'd be very rare today to hear that at all. I mean, the popcorn lung, it's sort of, how can I describe this? It's almost like when you're inhaling it, it'll create, it can sort of create I guess, a sound or whatever. It's almost like a sound of crackling popcorn. And that was created by, people who inhale too much over a long period of time. And maybe you're getting not the true vapor form in their lung, but more of the liquid, resulting in what people would describe as popcorn lung. But a lot of like I said, the technology has been changed over the years. And as well, in some of the scans of people's lungs, it actually shows little holes sometimes in the lung because of vaping. But again, not as common now because of the changes in technology and the systems that are involved in the vaping device. But it is something that did appear years ago, but definitely not as common now. Nicotine and youth. So as you saw by the graphs that I showed earlier, uh, with youth, the dependence with lower levels of exposure. So people or young individuals become dependent on nicotine a lot faster and at lower levels of nicotine use. It affects memory and concentration, can alter brain development, and exposure to nicotine during adolescence, it can cause reduced impulse control and cognitive and behavioral problems. So that's why it's a real concern when you see much younger age groups using uh, vaping products that contain nicotine. And not even if they just start off using some of the flavored liquids that don't contain nicotine, some will, then it'll progress to using some of the liquid products that do contain nicotine. So that's why it's of concern that younger people are using these products. I don't want to say as a gateway to then using nicotine in the device, but definitely you could see where it might lead to that. The device malfunctions, I'll just go back to that just a little bit. It's mostly in the battery, but defective batteries or vaping products that have caused fires and explosions is very uncommon. Some of the products that contain lithium ion batteries, those can definitely, or so if you were looking at using a vaping device as a smoking cessation aid, I would definitely try to look for one that does not contain a lithium ion battery because it can pose a hazard if it's not used properly, stored, carried, or charged properly. So there is some danger there in that. I don't know the exact science or engineering behind that as to why they're more harmful. You think about even going on a, well, maybe not now, but when we used to fly on airplanes, any laptops that contain lithium ion batteries, they don't want you storing those underneath the airplane, but keeping them with you because there is a hazard associated with the lithium ion battery, even changes in pressure and so forth. So they need to be stored properly, used properly. But device malfunctions are more and more the exception than they are the rule these days. In terms of just a quick summary of the health risks that I talked about, so again, it's addictive if it contains nicotine, can alter brain development in youth, exposure to e-liquids, vapors, all of that at varying levels of toxicity, but not as harmful as tobacco, so there is some evidence of that. Increasing battery output voltage may also contribute to increased toxicity. So again, the more power that it has, the more it can carry the aerosol into your lungs. And so you get more of the nicotine product, if it does contain nicotine, into your system. And then I had to look up this acronym, the National Academy of the Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, so NASM. They determined that there is conclusive evidence that e-cigarette use increases airborne concentrations of particulate matter and nicotine in indoor environments, much like a cigarette. More e-cigarette products contain and emit numerous potentially toxic substances. So the combustion process, similar to a cigarette, does contain or produce these toxic substances. And completely substituting e-cigarettes for combustible tobacco cigarettes, it does reduce. So again, even though there are some harmful products, there aren't as many harmful products in a vaping device, in the liquid in the vaping device, as there is in a cigarette. So it can reduce your exposure to those toxicants and or carcinogens that are present in a cigarette. So I guess the bottom line, it is a bit healthier than smoking a cigarette, but it still does have some risks. So is less harmful, as I just said, but for youth, any nicotine products is harmful. So this is where, in this screen here, just the debate. So you'll have one side, and these are two prominent researchers in the area of e-cigarettes. The one researcher, Dr. Glantz, says that electronic cigarettes are a problem. I'll just read the statement there. He says, e-cigarettes are widely promoted as a smoking cessation aid, but for most people, they actually make it harder to quit smoking. Someone who continues to smoke daily while using e-cigarettes daily has an increased risk of heart attack by a factor of 5. So some evidence there on that side that says that e-cigarettes actually increases your risk of heart attack. On the other side, Dr. Abrams says that e-cigarettes have the potential to disrupt the 120-year dominance of the cigarette and challenge the field on how the tobacco pandemic could be reversed if nicotine is decoupled from lethal inhaled smoke. So that side is basically saying kind of what I've been saying throughout this presentation, is that yes, there are harms associated with using e-cigarettes, but they are less than the smoke that's inhaled by your traditional tobacco product or your traditional cigarette. So I'm not going to come to a decision or say which side of the debate is right and which is wrong. I think they both have valid arguments here. There are harms on the side that says electronic cigarettes are a problem. There are health consequences. On the other side, where they say it's a solution, I mean, they are aware of the health consequences, but their argument would be is that the health consequences are less severe for e-cigarettes than your traditional cigarette. So possibly it could be used as a smoking cessation aids. If you are thinking of using an electronic cigarette or a vaping device as a smoking cessation aid, you should be aware that whereas your prescribed medications, your nicotine replacement therapies like the gum and the patch would be covered under your CAF drug benefit program, but e-cigarettes are not. They are not covered. The reason being, as it says there, is that there's not enough evidence to say that they support the effectiveness of being a smoking cessation aid. So that's why currently it's not covered. There's mixed evidence regarding the impact on tobacco use. So there is some evidence that e-cigarettes can help some current tobacco users to quit. particularly if you've tried to quit multiple times. And this is where I talked about earlier, reviewing your blueprint. What has worked for you? What hasn't? Maybe if you've, done a lot of things in terms of putting your blueprint, your alternative activities, people you're going to rely on, and then you've decided, well, the water wings theory, I'm going to try this medication, something like Champix or prescription medication. Maybe that didn't work for you, and now you've had a relapse. This might be the point where maybe you do want to consider using something like an e-cigarette if you've had multiple unsuccessful quit attempts. So it could be something that you want to do. Some of the evidence there is the second point says greater toxicity may occur with concomitant use of both vaping products and cigarettes. So that if you are looking to quit smoking, you probably should quit smoking the cigarettes and move on to the vaping product. And I know some people who they'll cut back on the number of cigarettes and supplement that with using an e-cigarette. You shouldn't do that because greater toxicity could occur in that case. And then there's a potential for escalated use of tobacco use among those who do not successfully quit with e-cigarettes. So a lot of people will just replace smoking a traditional cigarette with an e-cigarette. So that is another risk to, just something to consider when you are thinking about quitting smoking. Getting near the end here, so I'll just share the last two poll questions there. You can answer those. So again, it's something you might want to consider when you are quitting smoking. But again, be cognizant of the possible health consequences. A couple statements here from the Council of Chief Medical Officers of Health in Canada around vaping and youth. So the first statement there is in Canada, we've had tremendous success driving down youth smoking rates in recent years, but there is concern that a new generation of youth addicted to nicotine may lead to a resurgence in smoking or create new public health problems, reversing decades of progress. So, the rate of smoking cigarettes across Canada has decreased steadily, over the years to the point where it's not considered a major health problem. Population health-wise, it is for individuals, but population health-wise, it's decreased to such a level that it's not as major a health concern as it used to be. However, with the advent of e-cigarettes, and particularly where they're being marketed towards youth with the flavored products that first don't contain nicotine, but that's sort of a way, I guess, just with the way they used to have flavored cigarettes or cigarellos or things like that, that were actually marketed more towards a younger population. So they're concerned that that may be luring younger individuals in to become smokers later on in life. I don't know what the situation is in Saskatchewan, but I know where I come from, Nova Scotia, that they ban the sale of flavored liquids for vaping devices. So you can't purchase, or they're not available for sale legally in Nova Scotia. So no flavored liquids are available. I'm not up to date or sure what the situation is here in Saskatchewan. Where I'm at, or what particularly other provinces might have other particular policies around that. The second statement there says, while preventing youth from beginning to vape is a priority, we recognize that for adult smokers, switching completely to vaping is a less harmful alternative to smoking. That said, vaping exposes users to harmful chemicals, and the long-term health effects are unknown. So this is an acknowledgement that yes, it is less harmful to smoking, but there still are harms associated. So potentially it could be a smoking cessation aid. So just in conclusion, among young people, vaping is higher than smoking. So in one way, I guess that's good. Not as many young people are smoking traditional cigarettes, but they are smoking more in terms of vaping devices. Among never smoking youth, vaping is a true risk factor for cigarette smoking initiation. So there is some correlation between starting vaping and future cigarette smoking. There are low levels of toxicity with unknown long-term health effects. So I've already talked about that. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done on what the long-term health effects of vaping are. Likely that it's less harmful than smoking, but still nicotine, highly addictive. It's not a cure-all for helping smokers to quit tobacco. Way I would view it as, it's that the water wings. It's something to help you so that you don't have to just quit cold turkey. You can use something, you can view it maybe as nicotine replacement therapy, something that has a lower concentration of nicotine that you could use to help you to quit smoking. But it's not a cure-all. And the last statement there, more research is needed to evaluate the impact of vaping on population level tobacco use. So we don't know a lot about the long-term effects of vaping, its effectiveness as a cessation aid. So we need to really look more at policies and regulation. Like I said, in Canada, it's done by provincial jurisdictions. So some provinces take a more stricter stance on vaping than others. I think Nova Scotia might be one of the more strict provinces around vaping. In terms of the availability of the devices, the liquids not being flavored and so forth, but it will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So that was my little spiel on vaping. Are there any questions about it? I hope you perhaps learned a little bit more about vaping. Again, you might consider it using it as a smoking cessation aid, and that's perfectly okay. Just remember that it's not covered under your health plan within the CAF. But again, it might be something you want to. It is, research. There is enough research done that it is less harmful, but definitely, knowing in the past how the devices were a bit more dangerous, like Tyler just said there, maybe some lack of trust in terms of its use as a smoking cessation aid. But and I would be very, it is the tobacco companies who develop the vaping devices targeted towards a younger population, probably knowing that smoking rates of traditional cigarettes are a lot lower than they used to be. So they're trying to sell more product and get more people to smoke. So that's why I'd be a little bit leery as well about it. But if you don't have any questions, I'll just, as with all of our webinars, we just put up a few resources on COVID-19. So again, there's a lot of good resources out there. I won't go through all of those, but I'll just leave it there as we close. But if you don't have any questions, thank you for participating today. And I really hope that you found this series helpful. There is one more. So next Friday, there's the final webinar in this series. And again, it's a little bit more of a check-in, but I think I'm going to focus on medications, so prescription medications and nicotine replacement therapy specifically next week. And so I have a presentation on that I'm going to deliver, and hopefully you'll find that helpful as well. Maybe, Tyler, maybe the vape was developed by someone with crazy dreadlocks. I don't know. Who knows? I'm not exactly sure who developed it. So thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day. And if you're interested, have a great weekend as well. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about prescription medications and nicotine replacement therapy, I will be here the same time next Friday. So enjoy your day, enjoy your weekend, and maybe we'll see you next week.